Welcome! This is the first video in a three-part video series called Is Everyone Here? Strategies for Finding Complete English Families. This series was created for RootsTech Connect as part of the track of courses offered from iCapGen, and I'm glad you're here. I have a lot to share with you today. Is everyone here? That's the name of this class. And let me explain that title and introduce myself at the same time. I'm Jana Greenouch. My husband Brent and I have 7 children, all still at home. And sometimes we sit down at the dinner table. Brent and I look at each other, do a quick count, but there's so many people that we just ask, is everyone here? For those of you who have big families, you understand this feeling. Like when we take our children to Disneyland or any public place and they all have a grand time, but the only thing I'm doing the entire time is counting to 7, right? To make sure I still haven't lost someone in the crowd. Mothers don't like the idea of losing their kids. We try really hard not to, but we are only human. So the risk is real. For example, my grandmother, she had 9 kids. One of her children, my Uncle Tom, I've circled him for you here, he had Down syndrome. And we like to tell the funny but rather sad story of the night that the entire family went Christmas tree shopping. They went to quite a few tree lots looking for the perfect tree, and somewhere along the way, Tom had gone missing. No idea which lot they'd left him at. The happy ending is that they found Tom at the police station, cheerfully sipping coffee with the cops. I'm sure my grandmother felt terrible. I know that she loved all 9 of her children. She didn't want to lose anybody. No mother does. And yet, a lot of the time when I evaluate the work that we've collectively done compiling families of the past in online trees such as Family Search's tree or public trees on Ancestry or other sites, a lot of families look something like this. Big question marks, forgotten children. And the really sad fact is most people don't even realize what they're missing. They find whichever children are most easily accessible in the records and they call it good. I'm not sure the mothers of the past like that idea. So the title of this class reflects this feeling and aims to encourage you to always ask that question in your research, is everyone here? Now, of course, historical records are limited and some holes are really difficult to fill. Some questions are just going to have to go unanswered. But the moral of this video series is don't leave anyone out if you can help it. Push a little further to see if you can more confidently answer that question, is everyone here? And I'm going to talk about some helpful tactics and methods for accomplishing this in England research. The principle is important everywhere, but the specific strategies and examples I'm going to share with you today are English. I am an accredited genealogist specializing in English research and absolutely love using English records to find families. So this session will be a lesson in England methodology, which would also be very similar to methods in other areas in the British Isles, like Wales and Scotland. Now, you may say, Jana, my goal is to push back to find my direct ancestors in a straight line. I just want to fill out my pedigree chart and take it as far back as I can. Don't necessarily need to find all the kids in a family because I only descend through this one. And if that really is your goal, fine. But even if that is your goal, let me explain why you really need to be seeking complete families as you go along anyway. Number one, no one comes to this earth without relationships. Whether those relationships are happy, ideal, or not is irrelevant. If we're going to record a person's history as accurately and completely as possible, we have to include the stories of their relationships, the ups and downs of their complete family experience. If I am a mother from the past and I have 7 children, and 3 of them are hard to find in the records. Maybe they died young, so they're not on a census, or their name was mistranscribed in an index, so they're not showing up in anyone's searches. I'm not content for you to tell the story of me and my 4 children. I had 7. Thankfully for me, I've never had to bury a child, which is actually a miracle because mine come prematurely and they spend some time in intensive care. But we have amazing technology and medicine these days. And here they are, all 7 of them. And they're very tolerant when I dress them up like little pioneers. I'm very blessed, but buried babies and children are a real part of family history. That is the story of nearly every mother and father from the past in areas where mortality rates and the quality of life were low. England was certainly no exception. Parents lost their children, and we want to figure out who they were so we can tell the complete story of each family. A second reason to seek complete families is this. The answers to many genealogical brick walls, or the proof, the evidence to link generations, to jump back another step in our pedigree charts. This evidence is often discovered when we broaden our perspective to research the whole family. And I'll share an example of this in a minute. And sometimes you have to think quite broadly. I'm not merely talking about the complete list of children for one family. You've got to include maybe stepchildren, other marriages, or even extended family members like aunts, uncles, cousins, grandparents. Here's an example of what I mean by broad family research. I was trying to determine whether or not William and Alice Marsh from the parish of Checkley were the parents of my ancestress, Sarah Marsh, who I know lived and died in Doveridge. It's a nearby parish. Her marriage record said that she was from Checkley, and also that her father's name was William Marsh. As far as I could tell from the censuses and church records, he was the only William Marsh in town. So the odds were very good that I had the right guy. But the evidence really started to stack up when I began to research William and Alice's complete family. This was prior to civil registration of births, so using church christening records, I reconstructed the William and Alice Marsh family of Checkley. It came together like this, and it looked good. Sure enough, they had a daughter, Sarah, christened about the right time to match my Sarah. Most researchers would probably stop right there. But as I located more records about this family, I happened to notice that one of the witnesses of their daughter Anne's marriage was Sarah Marsh. Witnesses were often close family members, like siblings, for example. I compared the signature of Anne's witness, Sarah, to my ancestor Sarah's signature on her very own marriage record that I already had. And I found that they were indeed the same signatures. The letters are all formed the same way. It's clearly the same person. This was pretty solid evidence that my ancestor Sarah was actually part of this William Marsh family from Checkley, and I wouldn't have found that unless I was looking closely at the other children in this family. If I didn't take the time to learn about this sister Anne, I would not have been quite as confident about adding this William Marsh to my pedigree chart as Sarah's father. Researching the complete family can stack up more and more evidence like this to make our genealogical conclusions much more solid. Okay, let's talk demographics for a minute. This is important to understand. You can see from this chart I've put together that until about 1900, fertility rates in England were somewhere between 4 and 6 children. Now, that's the average number of children born per woman. If you calculate the rates of fertility for married women only, the rate would actually be much higher than this, somewhere between 6 and 10 children per married woman through the mid-1800s. As we've already discussed, many young children and babies didn't make it into adulthood, perhaps, so families don't always appear in the records to be as large as they really were. In general, unless something happened to mom or dad, families were big. However, as England approached the turn of the century, 1900, fertility rates drop off significantly and eventually hit record lows within the last 100 years. Today's rate is around 1.6. So finding complete families in the 1900s or the very late 1800s is a different ballgame than finding complete families in earlier time periods. So keep that in mind. Let me recommend a wonderful website hosted by the University of Cambridge where you can view demographic statistics, things like fertility rates, life expectancy for specific regions of England for the mid-19th century on. And this can give you some really great detail about what the norms were in the exact locations of your English families. For example, you can see from their maps how in densely populated areas like Manchester, for example, infant and child mortality rates were significantly worse. And even for the whole of England in the 1800s, at least 1 out of 10 babies never even made it to their first birthday. I love using this site for those kinds of insights. It's worth asking, why might families have been bigger in the past than they are today? And that's a complicated question with lots of answers, which I won't attempt to cover in this series. But things like the availability, the understanding of contraceptive methods played a huge role, which is why this slide doesn't quite apply after about 1900. But before then, you can expect reasonably that on average, a married woman on your English family tree probably was married by her mid-20s. You know, could differ, but that's an average. She will have had a child every 1 to 3 years from the time that she married, or even possibly before. That was not uncommon. And she will follow this pattern all the way into her 40s, having a child every 1 to 3 years, unless, of course, she died of childbirth or something else along the way. Every time you see a gap in the children of more than 2 years, maybe even 1.5 years, you need to be asking yourself, am I missing someone here? You may or may not be, but the answer in many cases is yes. Whether it was an unrecorded stillbirth, miscarriage, or a child that lived and is just not obvious in the records, this is how nature was, and you simply cannot assume that you're not missing someone just because you haven't found a record of a child there yet. So the number one strategy I have to share with you today is to be mindful of this. We'll use this common signage from UK railway stations to remind us to mind the gap. Every time you research a family, mind the gaps. Look for the spaces and ask the question, is everyone here? All it takes is to create and evaluate a family group sheet or a timeline of the family you're researching. Also, pay very close attention to the beginning and the ending of children in a family. In English history, many couples conceived their first child before they were married, and then, of course, they hurried and got married in most cases, because if they didn't, well, then they had parish officials busy making sure the responsible person was going to take care of that child. Those stories make for some really great paperwork that genealogists enjoy discovering. But once a woman did arrive eventually in her 40s, sometimes childbearing slowed down and you can expect some bigger spacing between the children. That's just a natural reality. You never know, so you look carefully during those years too. For example, in this family, Mary is 40 years old at the birth of her baby, Richard, but we're not going to assume that that was the end. We'll keep looking for a few years after that. Successful genealogists ask questions. They say things like, what was happening at this time that would explain a gap in children? Have I looked for a buried baby? Did the family move or attend a different church? And that's why we don't find a christening or a burial in the expected parish. What was going on in town at that time? Was there a disease outbreak that killed a lot of children? Was dad off to war or at sea or working away from home? Or in the case of my ancestor, was dad spending time in prison? And that's why we have a gap in children. It's awesome when we can answer family gaps with historical records. No kidding. Here's my ancestor Henry's family. He and Catherine had children reliably every 2 to 3 years, except this 4-year gap. I searched the parish registers, combed through the christenings, the burials. I looked very carefully at the actual images, not just the indexes. There were no possibilities in civil registration records. And the city directories and land records proved that this family had stayed in that town during those years. So I really wasn't sure what had happened in that gap. I was ready to chalk it up to a miscarriage or a stillbirth. And then I read the local newspapers. You can find some real treasures in court records or newspapers. They tell an interesting story about the mess Henry got himself into with some butcher in the town next door, something about an unpaid debt. He was convicted of fraud and sent to prison to await trial and then serve a sentence in jail. It's hard to father children when you're locked in a jail cell. Question answered. So mind the gaps. Ask questions about what might have been happening and then look for the records that might contain the answer. Might be a needle in a haystack, but it'll be worth it. Genealogy is a treasure hunt, right? In the next 2 videos, we will dig in a little deeper and take a look at some methods for finding complete English families using censuses, church records, probate records, civil registration records, and more. So I'll see you in video 2.